Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. The podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bit in between. Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. The podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bit in between.
And welcome to this episode of 1202, the Human Factors Podcast, with me, your host, Barry Kirby. Hopefully you're all embedding in now to the new sounds and the new website and everything for the podcast. And thank you to everybody who's been feeding back about the new social media, the new website, etc., etc. What I hadn't reckoned on was the new insights into listenership that we have for the podcast. I've always largely assumed that everybody would be largely UK-based or maybe to push in the US, but it turns out we have listeners over 60 countries, which quite frankly blows me away and I think is simply amazing. And so I thank you all for your support. The new website does have a voicemail facility, so I'm quite keen to test this out. So do feel free to leave us a voicemail telling us where you're from and where you're listening from, and we'll do our best to try and put a montage together if at least more than one of you actually do it. That would be fantastic. So a bit of encouragement there. But back to today's episode. Today's episode is really what I would consider an underpinning fundamental. In my drive to understand the wider application of human factors principles, I saw a tweet a few days ago about a book that was being launched, not a million miles away from where I'm at, about what I would consider to be two big hitters. The first being the design of spaces, design of public spaces, and secondly, designing for an ageing population. And it's all been smashed together in one book, which I think is utterly fantastic. As we're living longer and getting older, then it makes perfect sense that we should be designing spaces to take into account the accessibility issues we're all going to have to face at some point. Therefore, I reached out to Professor Charles Musselwhite, who's the author of the book, to see if he'd be willing to have a chat about the drivers behind his book. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that he was willing, and he is here. Welcome to the podcast, Charles.
Thank you, Barry. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the book and everything, you're currently Professor of Psychology, holding a chair in the Psychology Department at Aberystwyth University, like I said, just down the road. Could you give us a bit of an insight on what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I've only just started there, so I've only been there at the moment for the last couple of months, but I was brought in really to make more of the research that's already done in psychology at Aberystwyth, which is great. They've got some excellent people there who are doing lots of really applied-based research, so applying it to the real world, which is really my thing. You know, that's why I went into psychology originally. It was really, you know, how do we apply that psychology theory to real-life issues that can make a real difference to everyday life, you know, and the ordinary everyday stuff. So there's some great people at Aberystwyth doing stuff about rural healthcare, about improving people's active lifestyle, so getting people to do more physical activity, some good stuff doing language acquisition, you know, a real mixture, but all very applied and all trying to make a difference. And I thought, you know, I'd quite like that role to try and make more of the research they're doing there, make them, you know, bring in a few more interesting projects. Let's make the most of it, really. So that's been really nice to start there, start somewhere fresh and new, and yeah, get the best out of people.
That sounds really cool, because the whole point, so having been involved in research for a number of years myself, the ability to actually apply the stuff that you know, to actually bring it off the page and actually show that it can make a difference to people's lives, that's got to be something that's hugely rewarding.
Yeah, I mean that's really always been my thing since my undergraduate days. You know, psychology came to life for me really when we moved away from the theoretical stuff on the piece of paper, and then applied it to real life. And then you realise, you know, some of that theory does actually work quite well, but some of it needs adapting or changing. And again, particularly, you know, in my field where I'm studying now, mostly older people, sometimes those theories have been developed amongst younger people. They've been developed with certain cohorts, you know, and again, we live in a world where I think we've created lots of theory around middle-class white people in the Western world, and sometimes that doesn't fit, you know, not even older middle-class white men in the Western world, but let alone other countries and things like that. So, I mean, that you know, it's a real. I think research is a real privilege when you get to work with people and apply all of that detail and all of that really interesting theory, into a real-life situation.
So you talked about getting really inspired to it with your undergraduate degree. How did you what made you wanted to study psychology in the first place? How did you? What was that sort of that ticky moment that decided that this was going to be the career path for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I was, I first got into psychology. I took it at A level. And it probably, I got a B in it at A level, so it wasn't the subject I did best in, but I did well in. It was fine, but I thought, well, there's something there I'd really love to study. It's really nosiness, I think, at the end of the day, and wanting to understand how other people tick. Really, I'm fascinated by the way we all live our lives, and what makes us motivate to behave in the ways that we do. So, I did end up taking psychology at Southampton University, and again, it wasn't really until the third year of that where you got to choose very different subjects, of your own choice. And I chose a really interesting module that was headed up by a chap called Roger Ingham. I think he's still there now. And what it did, it applied psychology to real life issues. So it applied psychology to sex, football, and road safety. And therefore, quite a lot of the lads took it. But interestingly, the bit that I found most interesting was the road safety bit. Right. He looked at younger drivers, and he asked the question, why do young males have more road traffic collisions than people of middle age, and even younger females? They're a group, and still are today, that are absolutely over represented in the collision statistics and injury statistics than they should be for their age group. And there was a lot of stuff out there at the time about them being inexperienced, about their brains developing in different ways, but actually he just brought it down to really simply doing lots of really good interviews with younger people and asking them all about their identity, their status, their roles, who they were. And it was all about how driving fitted that feeling. They were a long way from death. They wanted to express themselves. The car was a way of doing that. I thought, this is absolutely fascinating. So that I went on and did a PhD looking at how boy racers changed over time. So that was the first time I started looking at older people during my PhD, which was at Southampton University as well. And I wanted to look at how interventions improved people's road safety. So traffic calming, does it work? Sometimes for some people, but often those you don't need to slow down already will slow down even more for traffic calming, whereas the boy racers tend to see it as a challenge and go as fast as they can, unless they've got a really souped up car they don't want to damage. But then I was interested, what happens to boy racers as they get older? Because being a boy racer is very much about showing expression and identity, impression management. This car is something about me, the way I drive is something about who I am. Particularly important again, but why young males do it, where they haven't quite yet got a job to say their identity, haven't got a home of their own, they might still be living at home. The car is the next biggest thing to show off that's about them. But what happens as they get older? We did find older people still use their cars to express their identity and say something about them, but in a very different way. So they don't use it driving fast or doing skids, or it's quite the opposite. An older driver who wants to show that he's still a really good driver will drive ultra safely, ultra carefully, and be able to tell you all the details about their what's going on the road based on their history and their experience. So I thought that was fascinating. So the same mechanisms are actually at play, they just play out in a different manner. Even the old boy racer who buys a Porsche with his retirement money or something like that, like I've come across, or they've got a Mercedes that they cherish and it's 20 years old. It's saying something about who they are. And I just thought that was fascinating. And then, from then on, I probably just gradually won more and more research projects in an aging population. It wasn't just road safety. It ended up being about travel and transport, getting out and about in general, and how important that is to people, how important that is that people aren't lonely, aren't isolated, they can connect to the things they want to do. So lots of that ended up being built environment research, architecture, urban design. And over the years, probably a few projects about walking and active travel and things like that. And that's, the book is a culmination of sort of bringing together lots of the research, lots of the little research projects I've done on walking and trying to put it together in one place. Because I think, I had something to say there that might help a little bit. And it's fascinating, under-researched topic, really.
Yeah, and we'll dive into the book into a second, but you obviously just started your current role recently, but we've also had the pandemic, which has impacted. I mean, must be for yourself in how you teach and deliver your lectures, as well as complete your research. How have you found working during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's for a transport-based researcher, it's absolutely fascinating to see, just how people adapted really quickly to a very different way of life that involved far less travel, I guess. And we saw, some people, or some parts of that, I think people saw as a real advantage. People. Everybody's faced it very differently, during a very difficult and probably pretty horrible time. But there have been some real positives to come out of it. People have appreciated a bit more time not commuting. People have appreciated, perhaps a bit less pollution in their local environment, a bit less noise, perhaps reconnecting with their neighbourhoods and their communities a little bit more. We had some researchers working for me. I was at Swansea University at the start of the pandemic. That's where I've moved from a moment. And I had some researchers there who worked in the local community asking, local older people how they were getting on. Are they doing all right? And we found really mixed reviews from, half the older people said they'd never been so connected to their local community and their local area, and people asking them how they were, or even they themselves helping out other older people. And we had other, older people who were really isolated and more lonely. Their clubs had stopped, their groups that they go to that's so important had finished. They were worried about getting public transport, if there was public transport available. They didn't want to get taxis, they didn't want to get lifts with other people, so they were very isolated, and it made it, there was a big divide. And I wonder whether that's happened, quite a lot amongst lots of age groups, lots of people, lots of different individuals from different backgrounds. The pandemic has sort of shown where there's a big divide in society between the people who've done all right out of it and the people who've ended up being, a lot worse. And at the universities, that affected the way we taught. Students can't possibly be having as good as experience as they hoped for. Lots of teaching we know is so much better when you're doing it in person and you can interact with people and chat to them and you get feedback immediately. But that said, I think we've adapted really well to some really good online lecturing, some really good online things. We've had to be much more creative and think about the pedagogy for we ought to be doing that anyway, but it's really, highlighted or got us to focus on it. What works really well as a lecture, what works really well interactively? How can you do that online? What works really well? How do you mimic group work when it's at distance and things like that? And it's made us pay a big attention to how we deliver things, I think. And so that's been quite stressful to do quite quickly. But over the long term, it should end up with, I think, a better offering to students. There's no need to have huge classes all together being talked at for an hour. You can break it up and do it better by small group teaching in person better, and some, coupled with some really good online materials as appropriate, I think. So, yeah, hopefully we'll come out of this better if we learn from it.
I like the optimism. I think that's no, but I do think it's been quite stunning in many ways just how quickly a lot of the universities have turned around the offering. I know there's lots of issues and complaints about whether students are getting the full experience that you would expect. Well, clearly you're going to get a different experience because it's a very different atmosphere. But the speed in which lecturers turn around, content and made the best use of the technology, because at the start of this, things like Zoom and Teams and that weren't really that mature, and it's really shown just how immature that they were. But they've turned it around they've turned the technology around quite quickly, and people like yourself have been able to jump on that and use it to the best of its ability.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you start realizing, actually, I think there was a lot of resistance to using that technology in teaching originally, but actually you realize it can't replace all different forms of teaching. Still in person, in small groups, that's the best time I have. If I've got a group of 10, 12 people in front of me, or you can split the class into smaller groups, 4, 8, 10 people, and you get them to focus on some things over a period of an hour, do some interactive stuff. That works really well. But yeah, it's the delivery of those pieces that we used to do to a large group of 400 or 500 people or something like that. No need to do that anymore. You can pick that up by a really good, you have to do it well, but a really good online presentation. Doesn't have to be an hour. You do 15 minutes, get them to read something, perhaps another 10 minutes, and then you then bring people out in group work from that. And I think there was, we hadn't really thought about how to mix and match the technology with reality before. And and now we can hopefully do that a lot better moving forwards. But yeah, it's the speed of having to adapt to that probably wasn't the greatest, but perhaps otherwise it would have taken too long to come around to that. So it's really nice. Yeah, it's a potential for learning to get much better, I think.
Cool. Right. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back to actually talk about the book.
If you're a human factors practitioner or in a related discipline and are not already a member, then do look up the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. They are the professional chartered institution for all human factors practitioners. Find them at www.ergonomics.org.uk.
So you've launched this new book, Designing Public Space for an Aging Population. So you've already hinted at why you started to put it together, but what was the driving force behind you writing it and publishing it now?
Yeah, I think, like I said, it was probably a culmination of lots of little projects I'd done that had done either a big project that had looked at pedestrians and walking in a small way, or I'd only got a few £1,000 to do a study about walking. And sometimes you don't get those things published because they're too small on their own, or they're for a company, or they're individual. But if I put together the knowledge, then you end up with being able to do it quite well. I mean, I've always been inspired by work that's happened in the past about the built environment as well, and I'm thinking, how do I apply that better to an aging population? I've got something unique there to say about that. There's some great work by Gail and Donald Appleyard and people like that, been around for years, and it takes the population as a whole, making spaces much more about people at the end of the day. But I thought, here's a gap in the market, if you like, a little bit, to apply that to an aging population, particularly at the moment, where we've got a huge increase across the world with, aging societies, more people living longer than ever before, particularly in Western society, but lots of other places as well, and the UK is a good example of that. I think it's something like 1 in 5 people in the UK will be aged 65 or over, in the next 10 years or so. So that makes a big difference to, how we need to design our spaces, I suppose, to enable walking. So that's where I came from, I think, to the book.
So with the book itself, who's it actually aimed at? Who are you trying to guide and maybe influence with it?
Yeah, because it's always about very applied psychology. I mean, academics, of course, are one of the audiences, and the book hopefully will end up in lots of libraries around the world and be used by academics and researchers looking at that. But I did hope that I wrote it in a way that practitioners, policymakers at the end of the day can get hold of it. So, everything from planners, town and country planners, urban designers, architects, possibly people working in healthy aging spaces as well. So, how it's really that link between home and getting out and about into the outside world. How do we make that easier to do? So all those actors who are involved in making that, from designing the home and the streets, the planners, the designers, to the older people themselves and the groups that support older people in that area. I mean, it could be for health, public health, as well as primary healthcare, secondary healthcare as well. How do we create a space that's healthy at the end of the day, that people can walk and potentially also cycle in? But walking was the main focus here. But active travel at the end of the day.
So that's almost really well suited for being in Wales as well, because obviously the government has a massive active travel policy, as well as the counties also have a really big driver behind them for their policymakers. But it sounds from what you're describing that almost anybody who's got any sort of touch in that urban space, the design of it, or even just enjoying it, this is one of them few books. It's probably for everybody.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I think it's so important that it often gets overlooked, if you know what I mean. I think, I start the book by saying every single journey begins as a pedestrian. It does. And particularly I've taken the definition of pedestrian to mean, every every type of pedestrian. So it's not just walking. If you can't walk and you're in a wheelchair, using that as well. But it's that pedestrian journey. You know, even if you're walking to your car in the drive or in your garage, you're walking to it one way or another. So, you know, it often gets overlooked, I think, and therefore there's probably quite a lot of actors involved in making that space convivial, if you like, to an aging population, and therefore perhaps there's an element of being able to, you know, pass the buck a bit. It's not my responsibility to do it there, or pass it to the individual. That quite often happens with transport. You know, at the end of the day, it's not our responsibility. It's down to the individual to do. You know, companies like to think they don't have to worry about workers getting to work. Shops don't have to worry about how people get to them. You know, once they're there, they'll look after them. But it's the journey there is the individual's responsibility, and that happens with the, you know, the pedestrian bit. And I think that's a cost to how our environment looks and feels for people who want to walk.
Okay, so in large handfuls, then, what are the current barriers to mobility? What are the big hitters we should be looking at?
Yeah, I've broken them down into. I've used a couple of models in there, some nice theoretical models, and tried to apply them to the real life, to that real life environment of walking. And so, really, in explaining the barriers, it's probably best to put them in those three categories of very. You know, at the bottom level, you've got the very physical characteristics of the environment, something I've kind of called infrastructure. And if you use a mobilities capitals approach, then, you know, that's your provision in terms of capital of the things that enable you to walk in your local area. So, you know, that's very basic stuff like pavements that aren't cluttered, that help you, that don't have, that are well maintained, don't have leaves and ice on them, you know, moving into the winter, particularly in Wales, again, this time of year onwards, those environments can be quite unpleasant and difficult to be part of, to walk around. You know, that's absolutely crucial to get right, that very fundamental bit. And one of the biggest areas as well when it comes to infrastructure is crossing the roads. That's a big pinch point for older people, because that's often where they're injured, you know, whether that's on a crossing that's formalized, or whether that's because they're crossing, you know, a street where there isn't a crossing in place to do that. I did a study a few years ago that suggested, you know, 88% of older people didn't walk fast enough for the Department for Transport in the UK's liking. You know, that they set the speeds at the crossing to 1.2 meters per second. And again, that you know, that's actually fairly quick. Again, in our younger years, we probably managed to do a crossing at that speed. We're probably not always walking at that speed, but crossing the road where we know we're going to do that smartly, we'll do it. But yeah, older people, you know, through no fault of their own, through completely normal things that happen to us all as we age, you know, our gait changes, physiology changes a little bit, we end up being, you know, just that little bit slower. Yeah, and I found 88%, I timed them crossing the crossings, 88% couldn't cross it in time. And for females, it was even worse. It was something like 94%. And if you've got any health conditions on top of that, you know, you're almost excluding everyone from crossing that. Now, you know, there have been some changes since I did that study, not entirely due to me, although I'd like to say it was, where, you know, they've changed the crossings to have those infrared cameras now across it. So they'll stay green for you to cross the road before changing back to green for the traffic until you've completed the crossing, although there is still a finite time you can complete. You know, you can't, otherwise people, I suppose, naughty people might dance around on the crossing and stop the cars ever moving again. But that helps a bit. But the trouble with those is for some unknown, or they do know the reason, but for what people will see as an unknown reason is they stick the green man now to the right hand side of where you press the button, and there's no green man directly ahead of you as you cross the road. Okay. So normally you cross the road and you look up, there's a green man ahead. It's green. Older people like that because they know that they're safe to carry on crossing. If it blinks green, it's flashing yellow for the cars. They know they're going to have to speed up. It just helps a little bit with their anxiousness with crossing. These new ones have it only on the right hand side where you press the button and it goes green and you make the crossing. Some older people have said, well, it's like being blind. You know, you've got no idea what the green man's doing. It's a big source of anxiety. Again, perhaps in your younger years, you're not that fussed or worried about it. But for an older person, it needs that little bit more confidence. Not having the green man there, you know, makes them anxious. So these new crossings, albeit give you a little bit extra time, you're crossing them not knowing what status the crossing is on. And that causes anxiety for older people again. And I think it was done so that you look to the right-hand side where the button was, so you're looking at the oncoming traffic as you begin to cross the road. That's the notion behind it, as far as I can tell. But where these things come from, again, I'm not quite sure, and I think they need greater attention. If we can highlight in research that these things are an issue, maybe they won't be designed in such a way moving forwards. Same with the 1.2 meters per second crossing the road. I think nobody can quite decipher where that speed came from. There doesn't seem to be any research apart from perhaps a 1950s master's thesis done in the States somewhere, and now all around the world people adopt that as the crossing speed. But if we can highlight these as issues, hopefully they could get taken up by practitioners, policymakers, and who might be able to make a difference, or a slight tweak or a slight change to the way that the infrastructure is developed. And then after, that's some of the key infrastructure things. There's lighting, there's blistered pavements as well, and that's interesting from a researcher point of view, because whose needs get put before someone else's? Do you put somebody who's got a gait problem that if they stood on blistered paving at a certain angle, they're going to trip or potentially fall, or at least stumble, or do you place somebody who's blind or partially sighted's needs before that person's? And I don't have the answer to that. I just think from a research point of view, where I haven't got to put these things into practice, that's fascinating to study. Lighting is key as well, and changes in lighting over the last few years to more sort of LED type lighting is problematic for older people, more focus but less dispersion of it. And then I look at the barriers in terms of legibility, because that's absolutely crucial to the local area. And we've looked at that in two different ways. There's formal legibility, so there's mapping of areas. And again, there's some great examples where modern pedestrian maps don't map with a heads up as being north, but they map directly what you see in front of you. So that's the space that's in front of you. But again, older people are used to using a map that has a north at the top. So again, getting them to think differently. Right. It's just about highlighting, I suppose, that this map is what's in front of you, not north facing. Majority of the population quite like those maps. The examples in Bath, for example, and they've got buildings on there as well, which are really useful, because that's how people often navigate by types of building or names of the streets or a particular square or plaza or place within that area. And again, traditionally maps are often just got the street name on them alone and don't have buildings on. So they're all important things, as well as perhaps taking the topography into account, giving people times it will take you 5 minutes to walk to this zone, 10 minutes to walk over here. This has got a hill on it, so this could take you longer, or don't do it at all. Older people would like that improve with things like benches and toilets definitely being mapped on there all the time, because that helps them complete a journey, especially up or down massive hills. Yes. But also there's legibility in terms, think of the architecture in an area. This area affords certain things because of the way it looks. So if an area is very open and wide and doesn't have benches in it, that doesn't feel like a space that's for you, probably for vehicles or something like that, even if there aren't vehicles there. Or it's a space that's normally a market but it isn't today, or something like that. Whereas if you create a space that looks like a place where you can walk with benches along the place, people will do so. Or buildings that tell you what they're doing. Lots of, I think, there's a big role for architecture in there to make sure that you're creating buildings that look like they should be. And lots of older people, particularly those perhaps in early stages of dementia or people with cognitive challenges, talking a lot about how they navigate local areas based on the way buildings look and the way buildings, are telling them something about that area. Oh, that's definitely shop, so I know I'm in the right space here. And then they'll anchor themselves to a shop that they remember. It might not even be that, lots of them talk about, in Swansea when I did some research, they talk about the Woolworths building. It hasn't been Woolworths since when, 2008 or something like that, but it's still known. Yeah, still known as the Woolworths building. So that, I'm not saying you need to map that on a map, but that's important to take into account how people remember these spaces. And not the old theatre and things that's perhaps now the bookshop or something like that, they still call it the theatre. So people need to know these sort of colloquial things that mean quite a lot to people, that help them navigate the space and the area. Then there's the barriers as well, sort of related to that, especially that last point a little bit about the aesthetics of the area. Lots of research has been done about this for years, about why some spaces are more attractive than others, and things like mystery and intrigue, creating playful spaces that look and feel like you want to go and investigate them or be part of them. And again, I think there's some modernist or even some modern architectural changes in urban design that, that probably deal very much with safety and make things very easy to be part of. But older people, well, people in general, don't always want that. They want a space that's a bit more interesting and novel. So I do mention in the book a little bit about, unplanned spaces are sometimes people's favorite spaces. You can over-plan and over-design, a space and actually design out the purpose as you've done it, or design out the feeling or the connectivity people have to that space. Milton Keynes is probably a good example of over-planning, over-design, and and other modernist kind of approaches. And again, we just need to take into account some of those lovely old-fashioned spaces that have little or more organic planning, or don't have any planning at all. Lots of older people talking about their holidays they enjoy in Devon and Cornwall, places like St Ives, for example. A nightmare in terms of driving around the place, but great for walking and investigating if it's not too busy down that way. But also, making the space attractive involves, just thinking carefully about how that space looks. Again, pedestrianisation, there's some terrible examples of making them far too open and bland, which again is probably quite safe space, but not one that people want to be part of. They want to be able to break that space up, have break it into different areas. So there's a seating area over there, perhaps there's a space to walk over that side of space. You think about all those different elements of an environment. So there's a ceiling, a wall, and a baseline to these places. Turn them into rooms is what a lot of authors talk about. And again, older people quite like that as an idea. The space has got to be desirable. It's got to pull people to it. And finally, just a point on the sort of cultural or the social norms surrounding a place. I think we've created environments where we expect to see certain things in certain places, and walking is something that's been forgotten about or ends up being lower down the pecking order a bit. It's seen as something that you kind of provide for after you've provided for the car or the vehicle. It's the bit on the edge between, getting out your vehicle and ending up in where you're going in the shop or places like that. So it's a space that's a little bit more liminal, if you like, or in between, and doesn't get the attention it desires. And some of that sort of cultural over the time, it's become some older people talking to me about how they don't feel, that they can just go for a walk in their local town or their local village. It has to be for a purpose. If they've got a dog, that's fine, taking a dog for a walk. Or if you're going to get a paper, that's absolutely fine. But just going for a walk somewhere that isn't, seen as an off-road walking place, just don't feel like they can. And I thought that's such a shame. At what point did we develop a society where walking is seen as so unusual or so difficult? And some of that's just the social norms and how things have changed over time, and over provision really for cars and vehicles at the expense of pedestrians. At the end of the day, cars and vehicles have brought us wonderful advantages, but at the expense of lots of disadvantages we don't even deal with or don't think about. And we need to start concentrating on them, not just for sustainability purposes, but, for an aging society and to encourage more walking. So they're the kind of four areas I look at in the book, and try and think about how we might piece together those elements to create a better space overall.
That's really, really interesting, and I really like this idea that that the spaces not only should be safe, but they should be attractive and desirable. And it's almost as if we sort of sit there and say, well, actually, just because we make them accessible, then they shouldn't be pretty. Is there any examples out there that, because I'm guessing with the amount of research you do, you must walk around like sort of towns and cities, and you probably never switch off, and you probably point like, oh, that's good, that's bad, oh, how dare they do that type of thing. Are there any good examples out there that you've seen and said to yourself, actually, that's brilliant, and highlighted best practice in a way.
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think, my family, my kids particularly get annoyed with me if we're walking through a town saying, "I've got to stop and take a photo," or, "Oh, have a look at that. For goodness sake, can't we just go in game and buy a game or something like that?" But yeah, and there are some good examples, but interestingly, they're in places where there's already, quite a bit of money invested in them. It's often in a tourist place. Interesting. I think of Nice in France. I've got some wonderful spaces they've created. They've got a great plaza near the front where they've got these fountains that come up from the floor and people walk through them. And it isn't just youngsters. I've seen older people walking through them. They keep you cool. It's a playful space. There's seats around the edge in abundance, loads of them. And you just walk through the bottom bit and then you're on that wonderful Mediterranean seafront. But of course, it's a very wealthy place. It's a huge number of people coming into the area. And London, again, has some good examples, particularly, again, if you think of walking spaces that end up turning into, with mystery and intrigue, lots of little pathways that end up then in a big plaza at at Trafalgar Square, and the little lanes that come off that around the edge. So again, I often, Bath, another example, as I was saying earlier, with really good mapping, and again, some mystery and intrigue mixed in with some big pedestrian areas that people feel very safe in. So they're often in quite wealthy places where there's quite a lot of investment being put into the public realm. And some of the worst examples come in your local villages or towns, where, again, thinking of the pandemic, lots of people have spent much more time in, and older people have wanted to get out and about and walk around those local areas, and they're just horrible for people to do so. They have pavements that don't continue, so they end, and then fast cars driving close to them. It's almost like we've forgotten about walking, apart from those places where it already is happening in big droves, and then it becomes a circular thing. So you look after the places where lots of people are walking anyway, but you're forgetting the places where we could encourage walk. I mean, it was very disappointing at the end of the pandemic to see some of those spaces they turned over to pedestrian areas, and some of those great outdoor cafe spaces we created in the UK, that rival some of those spaces in France, the Mediterranean, and places, and turned back to vehicles again. And yet, we may spend a lot more of our time working at home, or a lot of us might. So you might not need the room for vehicles, but that was by. Within a year, those spaces completely turned back, and I think people have quite enjoyed them. I didn't see a huge amount of people moaning about them, particularly as walking. Talking to older people, they've loved those extra bit of rooms. In Wales, there's a really good example when in Cardiff, wasn't there, where they changed the road outside the castle back to. They put all these lovely restaurants along the front, and now that's been turned back for vehicles to use it. And again, that really helps everyone, but it certainly helps those who perhaps got slightly more mobility difficulties. Again, that's not all older people, but it's more likely to be older people at the end of the day. Newquay, another example in Wales, where they've got that little one-way system around the town, and they totally took cars, apart from delivery lorries, out of there last summer. And I've never seen it as so busy. Lots of people, lots of different ages, all walking through it. I didn't see the shops suffering. I didn't see people not being able to get there, because people with disabled badges were still allowed to drive through, delivery lorries still drive through, but it just felt a lot safer. This year it's back to normal again. People are squashed into those narrow, tiny little pavements at the edge. And I do have older people telling me they don't go places because it's too busy, or they don't go places because they feel that it's dangerous. There's too many cars coming close. I can't really cross that road, or I wait till 4 o'clock to go there when it's quieter, or I only go there once a week because it's such stress. And I think we're missing some real opportunities, and the pandemic was one of them, to change some of those spaces, or at least meet halfway with the vehicles at the end of the day, and bring some of the space back for people at the end of the day.
It does seem to be with a few things like that we've had the lesson basically put right in front of our faces with the pandemic. Going back to what we were talking about learning styles earlier, we've had the lesson really in front of our faces and seen some successes in that way. I've seen it in sort of smaller villages like where I live as well. There's all these things that could be done, and then it seems to have been right, we've come towards the other end, right, back to normal, and we seem to want to strive to get back to where we were, not where we could be, which I think is potentially a disappointment.
Absolutely, I think you're spot on. I think that's really, really well said. I think there was such an opportunity to learn some really interesting, crucial things, like we have done in education, about teaching. I think, and that's going to make us make changes for the better. And we could have done that with transport, and particularly with walking. And disappointingly, that's being squashed out. You're right. It is trying to get back to business as it was as soon as possible, rather than thinking, how. And I think even if it's just been a few small changes here and there, would have made a big difference. I think I try and say that a bit in the book. We don't need to make huge changes to improve the walking environment. Quite often, it's just a lack of people who can make these changes not walking in that area themselves, so they don't notice that there's a broken pavement or non-dropped curb in an area, or that bit's really dark at night, or that bit just needs an extra pavement to join up to there. And then with the amount of cost that it would be is far cheaper than it would be if we built a new road, for example. But they still seem to be, championed at the expense of pedestrians at the end of the day.
Yes, and I guess this is going to be an ongoing battle for quite a while. So the book, this sounds like it's a book for quite a few people. That there's going to be a lot of people who would learn a lot from it. So where can people go to go and buy the book?
Yeah, it's published by Emerald Publishing, so it's on. You can go via their website, which is books.emeraldinsight.com, and then search for it on there. I mean, I often go on there to search for aging books. So if you go on there and type aging as in the search thing, I think it comes up as one of the top books on there. And there's a couple, a few other good books on there as well. There's an excellent one at the moment being written by Sophie Yarka, who has looked at the social infrastructure around an aging population, which actually works really nicely with my book. So she's concentrated just on one bit of, communities becoming richer and having more diverse interests in them, so that people have got something to go to those places for, so community centres and things like that. So, yeah, Emerald Insight is books.emeraldinsight.com, and have a look at the aging books on there, of which my one is one of them. You can get it at other online sites as well, but that's the original publisher's one on there.
Brilliant. Now make sure that the link to that is in the show notes for anybody who needs to get them. This is clearly a hugely important topic. As we as humans end up living longer, the accessibility of our public space is only going to become more important. But accessibility shouldn't mean dull or sterile. They should be enjoyable by everyone. But also we should let people interpret their own use of a space and not be quite so dictatorial about its design. Charles, thank you very much for your time today. How can people get in touch with you if they want to know more about designing public spaces for an aging population?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to be emailed. So my new email sounds a bit like something out of, I don't know, Human Factors. It's chm93@abba.ac.uk. chm93@abba.ac.uk. And I'm on social media. So Charlie Muss is my Twitter handle. And I've got a website, which is DR for Dr. CharlieMuss.com, so CharlieMuss.com, and then you can find out a bit more about the research that I do that's related to these kind of things. But yeah, do get in touch.
That's fantastic, and all details again will be on our website. So Charles, thank you ever so much for your time today, and look forward to reading the book and hopefully catching up again soon.
Great, thank you. It's been great to be able to chat about it. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions and comments. You can contact us on social media such as Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook at 1202 Podcast. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense. Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions and comments. You can contact us on social media such as Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook at 1202 Podcast. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense.